Martial arts and body motions. Very nice to have you back again.
It's good to be back, Al.
Good. We got a very good guest today. He is one of the outstanding figures in the world of martial arts today. He is known as the father of American kempo karate and was one of the earlier popularizers of the art. He introduced it to the public through his many excellent schools and by serving as television's first technical advisor for the martial arts. He is also the promoter for perhaps one of the most important tournaments in the martial arts today, the Long Beach International Karate Championships. He is the author of the best-selling The Secrets of Chinese Kempo Karate and has just recently finished his fourth book entitled Nunchakas. I would now like to introduce you to Mr. Ed Parker. Ed, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Oh, nice to be here, Al.
Ed, before we go into some questions, perhaps you could tell us something on your background in the martial arts, like how you started, for instance.
Well, I grew up in Honolulu, and of course the area that I grew up in was, I guess it was like East Los Angeles and such areas as New York, where you have to pretty much defend yourselves at all times. And in order to uphold my father's standards and what he had set forth because of his religious views, I was forced on many occasions to go and rob the local safe, things that were not appropriate. And so in order for me to convince them that I meant no, I couldn't verbally say it. I had to physically say it, and that's what got me involved in this. And I've been doing it for about 28, 29 years now.
What about your first instructor, or what system did you go into in the beginning?
Well, I studied kempo, but the man I studied with was an extremely interesting guy because although he had studied from his father and picked up knowledge and swapped it with other people, he came to the realization that much of what was taught in the Orient, though it was very inclusive, wasn't yet rearranged to suit modern-day context. So he found that there's a lot of changes needed in order to make it work in our present-day environment. And it was because of him that I began to think this way from my early years. Now, when I first started here in the United States and had a lot of traditionalists come in, I was a rebel as far as they were concerned. But, you know, it's the guy that comes out in the end that really counts. And being a street fighter myself, I went along with this trend of thought.
So then you went on to your first book, or your earlier books, The Secrets of Chinese Kempo Karate.
Yeah, those were some of my earlier books, but what I tried to do there was to more or less get people to realize that there are many other systems in existence. You know, there are many type of guns. You got shotguns, handguns, skeet guns, what have you. Likewise, in martial arts, you have many types of systems, you see. And so I wanted people to realize the existence of many types of systems. However, now I'm, you know, going into more detailed information in regards to what I believe and what I'm teaching.
Right. I suppose that through this program, we're trying to do the same thing, to educate our viewers, not only the beginners, but also the advanced students that are not fully aware of some of the origins or history of the martial arts, or some of the differences in styles, and some of the issues we're now faced today in the martial arts. So we'll start off with the basic question that a beginner might be interested in asking, like, for instance, how are the Oriental martial arts related to each other, and how they compare to Americanized?
I think the simplest way so that most Americans can understand it would be this analogy. Now, judo is a more ethical form of jujitsu with the Queensberry rules thrown in, so to speak. Aikido is more or less a glorified form of jujitsu. However, all three, meaning judo, jiu-jitsu, and aikido, are Oriental means of wrestling, whereas kenpo, karate, kung fu are Oriental terms that define the Oriental means of boxing. And so there's your difference. Now, many people say, well, gee, do you have to study judo before you take karate? Or do you have to study wrestling before you take boxing? Not at all. Now, if you were to compare the two, meaning the American boxing, as to what we in the martial arts of the Oriental concepts deal with, we can then say that karate or kung fu is to chess as what American boxing is to checkers. And as you well know, that there's a vast difference between these two games.
Right, very well put.
Since the martial arts have traditionally come from the Orient, do they work against the American style of fighting?
Well, now let's talk about tradition. What are you talking about? Traditional ceremonial things or traditions of fighting, you know? Assisting me is Larry Tatum. And the art really is a fascinating subject. And I'm going to show you how it parallels more or less the things that surround us on a daily basis. Like, for instance, when we learn the English language, we learn A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so forth. Likewise, each and every movement that's learned is the same thing. Now, for instance, getting down, Mr. Tatum will be using an inward block, an outward block, an upward block, and a downward block. In the event he was to use not defensive moves, but offensive moves, such as strikes, we have what we call a back knuckle, which is striking back. We have punches, and we have circular type punches. And this, you see, formulates more or less the alphabets of motion. But now what happens when we put the two together? Well, when we put one alphabet of motion with another alphabet of motion, they then form a word. Like, for instance, if a punch was to come, this is one alphabet, this is another, and that's another. And when you use one hand, we then make a word of motion. But as you notice, this one hand is my variable throughout. My left hand was used no more than a constant. But now, let's make a word off of it and see what happens. So if this right hand makes a word, and the left hand also makes a word along with the foot, then we now compose a sentence of motion. And so that's basically how the arts can be developed.